Uh, my name is Yasser Mirdamadi, and I'll moderate this debate tonight or today. This is the fifth debate held by the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, iccnc. The central theme of still the 2024 debate cycle is belief and unbelief in a post-secular era. This session's topic is, does cognitive science undermine religious belief? To which Dr. Kelly James Clark provides a negative answer. No, cognitive science does not undermine religious belief, while Dr. John Wathey provides a positive answer. Yes, cognitive science does undermine religious belief. Before introducing the debaters, let me say two things. First, there will be a short question and answer part at the end of the debate. If you have any question, please write them down in the Zoom chat box and send them to my colleague, Dr. Masood, not to me, as I am busy moderating. Please keep your questions short, to the point, and clear, and specify to whom your question is addressed, if not both debaters. Second, you can use English automatic subtitles by clicking the live transcript button. Okay, the debaters agreed that Dr. John Wathey would begin the debate. Let me introduce both debaters. Dr. Kelly James Clark, PhD, University of Notre Dame, is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. He previously taught at Grand Valley State University, Calvin University, and Golden College. Kelly has held visiting appointments at Oxford University, the University of St. Andrews, and the University of Notre Dame. He's the author, editor, or co-author of more than 30 books, including Abraham's Children, Liberty and Tolerance in an Age of Religious Conflict, Religion and the Science of Origins, Return to Reason, which I assume has been translated into Farsi, The Story of Ethics, When Faith is Not Enough, and One Key Philosophical Terms and Their Importance for Theology. His book, Philosophers Who Believe, won third place in Christianity Today's Books of the Year. Dr. John Wathey is a retired computational biologist whose interests include evolutionary algorithm, the biology of nervous systems, and the biological roots of religion. He got his PhD from the Department of Neurosciences at the University of California, San Diego, and spent most of his career working on computer simulations of protein folding. His first book, The Illusion of God's Presence, explores the evolution of emotions and intuitions behind religious belief, emphasizing behavioral and psychological research. His latest book is The Phantom God, Why Neuroscience Reveals About the Compulsion to Believe. It relates the motivating forces behind religiousness to the neural security of embodiment. Mother-infant attachment, adult sexual pair bonding, addiction, selective attention, hallucinations, and many other neurological surprises. Okay, now let us see how Dr. John Wathey, in his 10 minutes opening statement, provide a positive answer to the question, does cognitive science undermine religious belief? John, please. Yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasser. First, my thanks to Dr. Clark and the organizers for the invitation. I appreciate their curiosity and intellectual courage. You really need courage to seek truth wherever that path leads. because comforting but false beliefs must sometimes be discarded, and close personal relationships may be lost along the way. If you're not willing to take such risks, then this debate might not be for you. And there's another reason why this path is difficult. It does not come naturally. Evolution has shaped our minds for reproductive success, not truth-seeking. Humans are a bundle of powerful intuitions, feelings, and attachments that distort our perception. Only recently have we found a reliable tool for seeing through the emotional fog and discovering the truth about reality. That tool is science. So does cognitive science undermine religious belief? Yes, I think it does. In fact, almost everything about science undermines religious belief in deep and fundamental ways. But cognitive science does so more specifically, especially when it tries to understand why humans tend to be religious. I'll begin with the general and then zoom in on the specific. Science demands coherence in our understanding of how reality works. If an explanation contradicts itself, it can't be right. By contrast, religion is full of contradiction at all levels, both between and within individual religions. This incoherence is the inevitable result of a flawed approach to truth, argument from authority, and truth by revelation, which are detached from reality and therefore completely antithetical to the empirical approach of science. I'll give you a specific example of a religious contradiction, one that offers an important clue as to where belief in God really comes from. Now, you can find this contradiction in the scriptures of all the major religions, but because our audience is predominantly Muslim, I will use the Quran. In Surah 15, verses 49 and 50, Allah describes himself as an all-forgiving, all-merciful dispenser of painful punishment. Now, painful punishment is not something we normally associate with boundless mercy and forgiveness. That's a contradiction. So why is God two-faced? Why do believers tell you their God will damn you to hell, yet in the same breath insist that he loves you unconditionally? I think the two faces of God come from two distinct selective pressures that shaped human nature during our evolution, an idea that I hope we can discuss later. But for now, let's get more specific. Consider the relation of mind and brain. The dominant religions all subscribe to the intuitively appealing view that the mind can exist independently of the physical brain. This dualism is the foundation of essential religious ideas, including life after death, universal consciousness, reincarnation, and God himself, who is typically conceived as a disembodied mind. Yet the overwhelming evidence from modern neuroscience is that these ideas cannot be true. The mind is what the brain does. Consciousness, memory, and language gradually develop as the physical brain grows during infancy and early childhood. When part of the brain is damaged, corresponding aspects of perception, thought, memory, and behavior are lost in predictable ways. As the brain withers and shrinks in old age, consciousness shrinks into senility, and when the brain dies, the mind vanishes. This unity of mind and brain means there is no heaven, no hell, no eternal soul, and no God. Now, thoughtful believers who hear the critiques I've just made will often reply, well, maybe so, but no matter what you say, no matter what science discovers, I know God is real because I have felt his presence. God is not a hypothesis, he's a person, and he lives in my heart. And this brings us to the cognitive science of religion. It is this aspect of religious experience, the feeling of God's presence, that I specifically try to address in my books. I offer a new hypothesis that explains this feeling as a completely natural phenomenon. Here's the essence of the idea, which has three parts. Part one is that a newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. Now, this is not a detailed image of a specific person, but only a sense of the existence of some vague primordial savior out there somewhere. More specifically, A newborn infant knows that its mother exists, that she knows how to help the infant, that she's able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Now, there's a bit more to it than that. There's also some physiologically critical information about mother providing nourishment, about her having a melodic voice, a feminine pitch, and about her having a face, including some rough idea of what a face is and what it looks like. So that's part one. Part two is that the circuitry in the brain that implements this innate model of mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. And finally, part three is that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the illusory feeling of a loving presence, especially, though not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. These feelings are often interpreted in religious terms because a crude mother-shaped vacuum is easily misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. This hypothesis is consistent with what we know about the newborns and hatchlings of many vertebrate species, and there is extensive evidence for it from the behavior of human infants, from studies of mother-infant attachment, and from neuroscience. It explains the ubiquity of infantile imagery in sacred scripture, and it elucidates several other long-standing puzzles, like the greater religiousness of women and the religious obsession with sex. It also makes predictions that have yet to be tested. The hypothesis does not explain everything about religion, but it nicely accounts for the unconditionally loving side of the two-faced God. Now, some believers might argue that this natural explanation for the feeling of God's presence does not prove that God isn't real. It merely reveals the mechanism by which God has endowed us with an innate longing for and receptivity to his love. To which I would reply, yes, that interpretation is possible, but it's irrational, untestable, and therefore scientifically worthless. By this reasoning, we could argue that our scientific understanding of electrostatic discharge in the atmosphere does not disprove the myth of Thor. The invisible god of thunder could still be up there in the clouds, pounding out lightning bolts with his invisible hammer and anvil. But how does this untestable supernatural fluff, tacked onto the physics of electromagnetism, enhance our understanding of reality? Obviously, it doesn't. It's useful merely as a rationalization for someone with a deep emotional attachment to belief in Thor. I understand the power of emotional attachment to belief in God. I was once a believer myself, and I have felt the illusion of God's presence. But now that I understand where those feelings likely come from, my commitment to reason and evidence leaves me only one conclusion. Humans create gods, not the other way around. And science is now discovering how and why we do this.
You have 2 minutes.
That's the end.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, John. Okay, we can save your 2 minutes for later.
I can take.
No. Okay. Now let us see how Kelly, in his 10 minutes opening statement, provide a negative answer to the question, does cognitive science undermine religious belief?
All
Kelly, please. Yeah.
Thanks, John, for that great opening statement. And I've read both of John's books, and they're really terrific. They're original, they're brilliant. And I, like John, think that there are natural explanations for why we have lots of things and lots of beliefs, including belief in God. So, and I didn't used to be like that. So, so I'm going to have more to agree with in what John has to say than some people will be comfortable with. I gave a talk one time, a debate with an atheist, and many people in the audience thought that I was going to come and refute evolution. And I affirm evolution, and I affirm evolutionary psychology, which John relies on in his responses. So they were extremely disappointed in me. And yet I think it was still reasonable for people to believe in God. So so I'll say where some places where I'll agree, and then where we part company. And I just want to start with a couple of supposes, and you should be able to see this on your screen now. Suppose you believe in other persons, the external world, in God, but then, like, you read David Hume, for example, and who's a philosopher that's famous for undermining arguments for belief in other minds or other persons. Like, how do you know other persons exist? I don't see Yasser here. I see an image of Yasser. How do I know there's a person behind that? But even if I saw him face to face, how would I know that Yasser is a person? I still would only see his face. I don't see his thoughts, feelings, or desires. And thoughts, feelings, or desires are what most essentially make us persons. So I know I'm a person because I do experience my own thoughts, feelings, and desires. But since I can't think, feel, or understand anybody else's thought, feelings, or desires, how do I know that anyone else is a person? That's first suppose. Second, suppose you watch The Matrix, or you read Nick Bostrom. He's a philosopher who's famous for arguing that we live in a simulated reality and human beings are just constructs in this. And so you ask, are we living in this simulated reality? Or you study the problem of evil, and you come to think, well, there's a problem here between an all-loving, omnipotent God and with the evil that there is in the world. So these are definite problems that are raised for cognitive mechanisms that produce our beliefs. And then the question is, should you stop believing in other persons, the external world, and God? And I think John probably would agree with this. We made part company later on some different things. I think rational belief begins with trust. And that's just something that we have to realize, that we know a lot of things but can't prove them. So I think we know that there are other persons, but no one has ever offered a good proof that other persons exist. So I think we have a cognitive faculty that produces belief in other persons. In fact, I think most of our cognitive faculties produce most of our beliefs most of the time immediately. We have certain stimuli, the cognitive faculty work immediately, and they immediately produce belief. If I say, Yasser, what did you have for breakfast? And he remembers having a cup of tea, and he said, I had a cup of tea, on the occasion of me reminding him or asking him, prompting him, he immediately forms the belief that he had a cup of tea. And I believe him because I believe what other people tell us. And a great deal of what we believe, we're social animals. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I think John's work is brilliant, but what do I really know? I have to take his word for it. And he did experiments, and other people did experiments, and he had to take their word for them. Like, I think it's astounding how much of what we know we accept just because other people tell us. Every class that you take, you read a textbook and it tells you so-and-so said this or so-and-so did this experiment and this was the result. All of my experiments failed, by the way, when I took science classes. I don't have any good experimental results for any of my things, but I still believe E equals MC squared and stuff like that. But I believe it because others tell me. And we believe that there was a past, that we weren't created 5 minutes ago with our minds intact, and that there's an external world. And so I've developed this sort of little view of rationality. I call it the rational stance. And it's not an algorithm. I think lots of people want an algorithm for when something's rational or when something's true. And I just think one thing we know about what makes something rational is that we trust the beliefs that are produced immediately by our cognitive faculties. We believe that there are other persons, that there's a past, that I believe that Yasser had tea for breakfast because he told me. And yet, as I point out here in point number 1, rationality aims at the truth, and evidence is truth conducive. There's no doubt about it. And that's what science has figured out in spades, is that evidence is truth conducive. And so it's the evidence producing discipline, and it's why it's been so successful. at getting at the truth. So I think we need to open ourselves to supporting evidence. That's a good thing for us to have. Belief begins with trust, but we also should be opening ourselves to supporting evidence. And that's the scary part. A lot of us don't like that. But here's the even scarier part. I'll come to that in just a second. The fact is, we're all subject to confirmation bias, all of us. Even John is as a scientist, and if you ask him, he would tell you he is, and that scientists are. All of us have a tendency to favor evidence that supports our beliefs, especially our most cherished beliefs, and to ignore evidence that opposes our beliefs. We know, every intro to psychology book knows that we all have confirmation bias. And to me, that means that so evidence against can be truth conducive. Evidence against our beliefs can help us give up beliefs that are false. And that's the only way I know of to overcome confirmation bias. It's super hard to do this. Let me tell you how hard it is. Recent studies have been done in cognitive psychology that show that, suppose Yasser and I disagree about global climate warming. He agrees with it and I disagree. Suppose I give him evidence that the science is all bogus or something. That my giving him evidence, this is how we're constructed, will make him less evidence sensitive, more sure of his belief, and more extreme in his belief. So the presentation of evidence can do the opposite of what we want it to do. We're often evidence insensitive. And that's kind of built into us. We try to preserve our cherished beliefs no matter what. So again, I think our only hope is we begin with trust, but then we have to hope, or then we should look for evidence for, but evidence against can also be truth conducive. Again, this is all against the background of trust. Even our acceptance of something new assumes, for example, one time, I'll just give a simple example. I was one time out walking in the college I taught at, and I looked a long ways away, and I saw Eddie, and I said, "Hey, Eddie." And I yelled it out at him. And then Eddie kept walking. When he got really close, Eddie didn't say anything. Eddie just kept walking toward me, and he got close. I saw it wasn't Eddie. So here's what our brains are very active. It perceives what we want them to perceive sometime. I saw someone roughly the height of Eddie a long distance away. I got a little bit of his face. And then what my mind did was fill in all the details. And so I saw Eddie. That's who I saw from a long distance away. And then up close, I see something different. Well, then I have to decide. I had to trust my cognitive faculties in the first place. And then in the second place, I had to trust them again and think, well, it's not Eddie. I had to give up my belief. That's an easy example, but I think that's the way belief works. I think it was rational for me to think that I saw Eddie. And I think I needed to be sensitive to evidence against that belief, and I gave up my belief. But all the time, I'm trusting that there's something in reality that corresponds to what I have perceived with my senses. So I trust my perceptual faculties, even though it gave me a wrong perception one time, and then what I took to be a correct perception the other time.
You have
So how about belief in God? Well, I think belief in God is reasonable without the support of evidence or argument. But then this is the kicker, unless we have adequate reason to reject it. And this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. So my answer isn't going to be, John is completely wrong in every person's epistemic circumstances. The question is, do you have adequate evidence against God? If so, then your belief in God is rational. And I want to point out now about cognitive science of religion. Does cognitive science of religion provide adequate reason against the existence of God?
So
I'm speaking here really broadly. The more
you have
neuroscience,
1 minute. 1 minute.
okay. The more neuroscience. I thought I got 2 extras, but does that constitute adequate evidence against belief in God? Well, minimally, one has to be aware of the cognitive science of religion and understand it and believe it. And I'm talking about whether or not a person is rational in that belief. And I don't think, but I haven't heard this, that John thinks that everybody is irrational in their belief in God because of what he's discovered, because most people don't know it. So someone has to fully understand it and grasp it. And I think Dr. Wathey has given good reason in favor of what he said. And then the question is, does it provide adequate evidence against God? And the first thing I want to say, this is the simple thing. I disagree with something he says in his paper. I don't think it provides evidence against God's existence. That would be the genetic fallacy. God might or might not exist. How we came to that belief is irrelevant. But this, I think, is his point, or should be his point. If he were a philosopher, it might be his point. I think that he's going after the grounds of belief. And he's saying the grounds aren't appropriately truth-aimed, or we can't trust the process by which the belief was produced. And so it was produced in a kind of ignoble way. So let me give you an example of this. This is the so-called Lake Wobegon fallacy. And this is everybody believes that they're above average with respect to leadership or popularity or investing ability. Men think they're above average with respect to driving or directions. So once you're informed of this fallacy, you know the thing that produced it is some underlying cognitive mechanism that was produced evolutionarily. And when you're aware of it, you might think maybe what I need is some evidence that I'm above average in investing or driving or something. At any rate, the reason that's offered has been offered to undermine one's trust in the faculty that produced it. I think something, so I could go on here. I'm just going to point out, if there is a God and people experience God, and notice this is an if, it's a conditional, then their belief is warranted, even if it's mediated by cognitive structures outlined by the cognitive science of religion. For one thing, belief begins with trust, and what we initially trust, until we have adequate reason to give it up, what we trust is something that's rational for us. And I think the same neurophysiological problems arise from moral and socio-political beliefs. John notes that evolution is not truth conducive. So this would apply to everything he says would apply to all of our beliefs. So suppose you figure out what the neuromechanisms are that underlie keeping promises or income redistribution or the right to vote. Does that undermine belief in that? It might if you had good reason to give it up, besides the fact that the cognitive faculties that produced it are ones that might not be truth-aimed. At any rate, there are problems in the neighborhood of other beliefs. It doesn't just apply to belief in God. And I'll just say one thing in conclusion. I think some people are in an intellectual position where their belief may or may not have been caused by God. They don't have much going for them by way of belief. The cognitive science of religion doesn't say that everyone has really firm and certain, I'd die for it, religious beliefs. It just says people are inclined to them. If you're one of those people and you come to think that your belief in God was mediated by the cognitive structures outlined by the cognitive science of religion, you might be in a position where you have adequate reason to seize it, in which case it would no longer be rational for you to believe in God. I don't think everyone's in this circumstance. I don't know how to settle all of this. There are lots of ifs and everything, but I think a person can have belief in God that's warranted, even if it's mediated by the cognitive structures outlined by the cognitive science of religion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Now we have heard the argument of both sides in their opening statements. It is now time for each side's rejoinder. John, let us hear your rejoinder for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, sure. Just give me a second to bring it up here. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Kelly, for those kind words. I appreciate. I've actually read your latest book and big pieces of two others, And I've come to appreciate your acceptance and actually enthusiastic communication of scientific ideas in your writings. It's unusual for a philosopher. So I appreciate that. I think we, like you said, may have a lot in common in our conversation today. But I hope in these few minutes, I'll identify a few things where we disagree. First of all, I'd like to say that I initially agreed to defend the yes side of this debate, in part because of Francis Collins, who many of you know is one of the most distinguished scientists alive today. In his book, The Language of God, Collins claims that the ineffable feeling of God's presence is evidence for God's existence. He writes, "Why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled?" Now, this is really a God of the gaps argument. We don't understand these feelings. Science could never explain this. Therefore, God did it. So my answer to Collins, which you heard in my opening statement, is that science can explain this. What feels like a God-shaped vacuum is really a mother-shaped vacuum. And because we now have a completely natural and testable hypothesis, that ineffable feeling is not evidence for God's existence. This is why I claim that the cognitive science of religion undermines religious belief. Now, Dr. Clark argues that if there is a God and people experience God, then their belief is warranted, even if that mystical experience is mediated by some natural mechanism, like my proposed innate model of the mother. He argues that we must trust our cognitive faculties because if we can't trust them, then how can we know that we're not just a brain in a vat being fed illusions of some non-existent world, like in the movie The Matrix? He then claims that if God exists and wants a relationship with his human creations, and this part of what I'm saying here comes more from his books than from what he just said in his opening statement, but he claims that if God exists and wants a relationship with his human creations, then God would guide the evolution of the human brain such that we are endowed with an ability to sense his presence under the right conditions. Therefore, the feeling of God's presence by this apparently natural mechanism constitutes a reliable perception of a real God. Dr. Clark says that my skeptical claim that this is a completely natural phenomenon and not a perception of anything supernatural, is only valid if I can prove there is no God. Now, I see two flaws in this argument, and I admit I'm not a professor, I'm not an expert at this kind of stuff, but to me, this looks like circular reasoning. The premise, if God exists, includes the conclusion, belief in God is reasonable without evidence or argument. Of course, belief in God is reasonable if God exists. That's assuming the conclusion. Now, the second flaw is that Dr. Clark has erroneously, in my view, reversed the burden of proof. He says, do you have adequate evidence against God? If not, then your belief in God is rational. But Kelly is the one making the positive assertion in his premise that God exists. The burden of proof is on him to provide the evidence for this assertion. In the absence of such evidence, no one is obliged to accept his premise. Let me transpose his argument to a different God. Last night I was walking in a storm and a spectacular lightning bolt shot across the sky with a deafening roar. I was so awestruck that I instantly knew in my heart that Thor was reaching out to me, warning me of his power and guiding me to follow his moral law. I don't have any evidence that Thor exists, but I know in my heart that that lightning bolt came from his divine hammer. The physicists tell me it's only electrostatics, the same thing that happens when I drag my shoes on the carpet and shock my finger on a metal doorknob. But if Thor is real and wants to reach me, he would have adjusted the constants of nature such that electrons can be easily stripped from atoms to make lightning bolts, and he would have shaped my mind to be terrified and awestruck by his divine handiwork in the sky. I trust my eyes, ears, and mystical apprehension of the Almighty. I know Thor is real. Can you prove he doesn't exist? If not, my belief is rational and warranted without evidence or argument. Now, this example is not far-fetched. Many Vikings sincerely believed in Thor. But I hope you can see the problem. By this reasoning, we can justify belief in almost anything. This is a path to confusion, not truth. If you're serious about finding truth, try the advice of Carl Sagan. Belief in the absence of evidence is a mistake.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, now let's see how Kelly's rejoinder is gonna go forward for 5 minutes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, John. That was good. I knew I was going to get slammed there, and I do have some response to that. But let me just point this out. So I don't think true belief is essential to rationality. So take people's beliefs that the Earth was flat in 3000 BC. It's a false belief, but I think people rationally believed it. And so a belief doesn't have to be true to be rational. What makes it irrational? And ironically, there are flat earthers today. I don't understand it exactly. What makes it irrational today is there's really good evidence against it, and people have to go look pretty hard. I don't know how they pull it off. I don't know how they can do it. And I'll say many of my religious beliefs, and I'll just take Christian religious beliefs here, are ones where I think the evidence is compellingly against, for example, a 6-day creation, which a lot of contemporary American Christians still believe that roughly 10,000 years ago, God created the earth in 6 days. And so they believe in a young earth. They believe that the earth was created in 6 days, and they think that everything was created by God directly. They deny evolution. Those are all positions that I once held. And I came to think the evidence overwhelmingly, the scientific evidence overwhelmingly counts against those. So I think the evidence can count against a belief. I don't think it does in every case for everybody. So people's belief. So it would be really odd for John's belief in Thor in this day and age, I take it, but it wouldn't have been for a Viking in 1,000 years ago, to think exactly what he thought, and they might think that belief is rational. And all I want to make is this point, John, that what's rational for people is really a function of time and circumstance, and we should be more generous than we usually are in claims to rationality. Now, John and Carl Sagan and others are worried that if you follow the trust first policy and evidence only comes later, that it will lead to confusion. I worry that if we don't trust first, it will lead to skepticism. So there are two risks here. In my case, in order to avoid the risks, I've tried to say, open yourself to supporting evidence, and also be open to contrary evidence. So, but I'm worried that if you go in the everything needs evidence direction, you'll end up being a skeptic, because there isn't evidence. You might think there is, but there's not evidence for almost all of our, let's put it this way, I'll leave science aside for the sake of this, but for almost all of our moral and socio-political and even religious beliefs, we don't have compelling evidence for it. Science has things to say about all of these things, and I think we need to pay attention to these. But science isn't going to prove that we should keep our promises, or that some sort of income redistribution is the right way to go, or that everyone has a right to vote, or that all humans are equal, or in a political sense, or, and the list could go on and on. So I'm more worried about skepticism, and he's more worried about confusion. And I will say, I think I'm talking here more about ordinary human beings. I just think ordinary human beings don't most of the time have the time or ability to proportion their beliefs to evidence. I wish more people did it about a lot of things. I'm not happy with the state of things. I think, for example, one political party that I don't align myself with doesn't pay much attention to either supporting evidence or evidence against. So I'm unhappy, and I see the problem that John is concerned with. But I think it's a difficult problem, and I don't know quite what to say to people that have these beliefs, because our intellectual situation is polluted by misinformation that people take as information now.
You have 1 minute.
Okay. Anyway, I think that, and John will know this if he's read my book, I think the proper response here is to think that lots of people, lots of times, are rational, and a person could be rational in holding their belief in God, but that we ought to have some kind of epistemic humility when we realize that we have to trust these faculties. But the more you understand about them, the more you understand that they're not as noble as you might have thought. John sort of kind of mines what's going on underneath all these things. We see the surface of our beliefs and think we're almost disembodied souls that sit above contingency and sit above having bodies and minds and brains that were shaped in really mundane ways, literally. But we're not like that. And I think that one of the things that this entails is we should trust our beliefs. We should be open to supporting evidence. And we should think we're not that much different from people who disagree with us. And so we should have I think most of the people, most of the time, are just doing the best they can to try to figure out what ultimate reality is like. Most people aren't philosophers, so they're not going to or scientists, so they're not going to spend a lot of time studying neuroscience or philosophical arguments. And yet, they shouldn't be evidence insensitive and should have some sense that we need to have our beliefs checked sometimes. And John's book is a belief checker. And I think it should, for many people, maybe all of us, create some anxiety in us. I think if we're all honest, we wake up, religious believers wake up in the middle of the night and think about what our religious beliefs are and wonder, could it all really be true? Is what John says is right? And I think you should have that feeling, because I think we're not, because that's the position that we're in intellectually. We're not in a position of complete knowledge and complete evidence. We could be exactly in the Thor position that he described. And the conclusion to me is that you don't necessarily have to give up your belief in God, but I think you probably should have some humility with respect to holding that belief and with respect to other people's beliefs who disagree with you.
Amen.
Okay. Now that we have heard the opening statements as well as the rejoinders of both sides of the debate, it's time for what is called intra-panel discussion, or you can call it free debate. The debaters can now interfere during the other side's talk by interrupting each other if necessary. But the flow of the discussion should be, if I may, maintained. Before going forward, let me interfere here very minimally. And let me pose one question to Kelly and one to John. Let me begin with Kelly. Kelly, it seems that you agree with the naturalistic explanation of religious belief. Still, you are saying that because we better to trust our cognitive faculty, that naturalistic explanation of religious belief, specifically the neuroscientific explanation of religious belief, does not disprove religious belief, because we better commonsensically to trust our cognitive faculty. But Kelly, don't you think that that naturalistic belief might undermine the explanatory power of religious belief, in the sense that if we can interpret or explain religious belief neuroscientifically without appealing to any religious metaphysical belief, then we can take off our Occam razors and cut off any religious presuppositions, and then that naturalistic explanation of religious belief would support a kind of naturalistic metaphysics. This is a question for Kelly and John.
Let me have a shot at that, and then
yeah, go ahead,
John.
please.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's a tough one, and so I don't think it disproves the existence of God. That was my point about the genetic fallacy. So I think the argument is better put as an undermining argument, and that you try to show that the grounds of the belief aren't really aimed at truth. For example, I might say, Yasser, where were you born? Where were you born, Yasser?
I was born in Mashhad, the city you were in Iran.
So you were born. So I might say that you're just a Muslim because you were born in Mashhad. And the fact is, we know that people take on the religious beliefs by and large of the place where they were born, but being born somewhere is not truth conducive for these high-level beliefs like that. And when you point that out to someone, I'm not trying to say Islam is wrong. I'm just trying to say you acquired it in a way that wasn't properly aimed at the truth. I'm trying to undermine the reason that you had for it isn't one that was getting you at truth, and rationality aims at the truth. It doesn't always hit it. We can have rational but false beliefs, but we're heading that way. And I think that's the way John's argument is most strongly stated. And I think it is. So I think it can be an underminer for some people in certain circumstances. And so I think it needs to be taken really seriously. And I've tried to describe some circumstances in which it's not an underminer. I actually think rationality is pretty easy. I think most people are rational most of the time. But John noted that I make stronger claims in my book about what would warrant a belief. And I think most people aren't warranted most of the time. So I think warrant is hard. It's hard to come by. I don't really signal that, John, in my book. So what would warrant it? And I'm not offering it as a circular argument. I'm just saying, hey, John, if all this happened, somebody would be warranted. And I'm not even saying they are really. I'm just saying if this happens, then they would be warranted. And that puts a burden on somebody to say why you wouldn't be warranted. It's harder, I think, to say why people, what would make someone irrational. I think it's pretty easy to be rational. And I think we need to see that most people are rational most of the time. And that is, I think most people want to believe the truth and think they're believing the truth and think that what they're doing is getting them at the truth, when in fact, by not being aware of the cognitive mechanisms involved, what you're doing is getting further away from the truth. So I like learning about the cognitive faculties involved. It keeps me up at night in ways that I didn't have this 20 years ago, John. I didn't do any cognitive science work. My former student was Justin Barrett, and who works in pioneer in cognitive science of religion, and he invited me to compare my epistemological views on religion with cognitive science of religion, which I knew nothing about. And I'm totally fascinated by it. And now that's pretty much all I read, but it's also disconcerting. It's undermining to read about it and think that we're not the perfect intellectual agents philosophers, I think, thought we were for 500 years. And it really changes the picture and has moved me towards being way more generous towards towards people who disagree with me.
Yeah, okay. Just a reminder to audience that we're waiting for your questions. Just type them in the chat box. And Kelly, yeah, I agree with you that the prima facie rationality is there. But don't you think that an explanation with more explanatory power is more reasonable than another explanation with less explanatory power?
Just one quick thing. I put in Google Drive a link to my book, God in the Brain,
yeah.
and it's free. So if people want a free book, there's a link. Just click on that and you can have it. It's free for electronic download. I don't think that that most of the time that what we're looking for is increased explanatory power. We're just trying to understand the world as it presents itself to us. I think scientists are looking for more explanatory power. Scientists are looking for the simplest explanation, and I think that's proven the best way to understand the natural world. So it's not the best. So here's the simplest explanation for other minds, and it's this: only I exist. That's the simplest. It has a lot of explanatory power. And I don't have to postulate any other beings. So if I were to apply the principle of simplicity, I think then I would just think only I exist. But that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to understand the world as it presents itself to me. Now, some part of the world, the natural world that presents itself to us, is really better done in the sciences, where you really are interested in explanatory power and simplicity and other scientific mathematization in some cases, depending on the discipline. The list could go on and on, but me, qua ordinary human being, that's not what I'm trying to do. So I don't appeal to the principle of simplicity. I don't think human beings on these sorts of things do. In the sciences, they do and should.
Okay. Thank you.
Could I interject here?
Sure.
In your book, you make it a little clearer that when you're talking about this principle of simplicity that you say science adheres to, you're basically equating that with Occam's razor.
Yeah.
And that's a complete misunderstanding of what Occam's razor is and is all about. Occam's razor is sort of a rule of thumb. It's not founded in anything other than the fact that it seems to be useful and helpful. Just a rule of thumb for distinguishing between two testable hypotheses, where both of these competing hypotheses equally explain the data that we have. They all make predictions. We do the tests. They all pass their predictions. There's no way by doing experiments that we've yet come up with that can distinguish between the two. Then when you're in that position, then what you do is, okay, we have no other way to distinguish. Is one of them simpler than the other? And if one of them is, we prefer that one. Always keeping in the back of our mind that maybe the other one will eventually turn out to be correct if we can come up with the right experiment to distinguish between the two. But scientists do not in any way adhere to a principle of simplicity that would cause them to reach the conclusion only my mind exists and all other minds are, illusions or fabrications of my thoughts or whatever. And the reason for that is that's an untestable idea. There's no experiment you could do to disprove that. So I think this is an important point. It's not the case that this so-called principle of simplicity that leads you to say, oh, well, if I really follow that, then I'm the only mind in existence. It's wrong to attribute that to science. Science does no such thing. That's not what Occam's razor is about. And maybe at this point, it would be useful to say a little bit about these related ideas. The idea that, I'm living in a vat and I'm being fed all of these false sensory inputs of an illusory world, like the movie The Matrix, or the universe was fabricated or created 5 minutes ago, and we were all created with false memories that make us think we have existed for years or decades, and light has been created, redshifted enough to make astronomers think the universe is 14 billion years old. But really, everything was created 5 minutes ago. There's no way to disprove that idea. There's a whole universe of such untestable ideas that a clever human could come up with. And the reason I don't take them seriously is not because I distrust my faculties. It's not because I think that that our sensory input is sometimes incorrect or whatever. It's because these ideas are untestable. They're, in the words of the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, they're not even wrong. They're worse than wrong. They're untestable. If an idea is mistaken but testable, you can at least prove that it's mistaken and learn something. But if it's not testable, that's the worst insult a scientist can give an idea, that it's not even wrong. And that's what this, these kinds of fantasies about living in a vat are to me. Now, when I was a kid and not a scientist, that's not why I believed other minds exist and why I did not believe I lived in a vat. I'd never thought of crazy ideas like that. I did trust my intuitions and my senses and cognition. And scientists do accept the idea that our senses and our cognitive mechanisms generally do align with reality, but not perfectly, and they're not specifically trying to. Evolution, in shaping our brain, is not specifically shaping it to make our minds and our perceptions align with reality. It's shaping all of this stuff to improve our reproductive success. And if you'll indulge me just a little bit more, there's one fascinating experiment that you probably are familiar with from psychology, in which subjects are shown an interesting movie. And before they're shown the movie, that's described to them, and they're told a task they have to do while watching this little video. It's about a 10-minute video, something like that. They're told that there's going to be a bunch of people. There's going to be 2 different teams of people, 6 people altogether, 3 in each team. There's a team of 3 people wearing white T-shirts and another team of 3 people wearing black T-shirts. And the white people, the white T-shirt people, are passing a ball back and forth to one another like a basketball. And the black T-shirt people are doing the same thing. They have their own ball and they're passing it back and forth among themselves. Their task of the observer is to count the number of passes done by people on the white team, the white T-shirt team. Okay, so that's all they're told. And they're told to ignore the people wearing the black T-shirts. So they show them the movie and people concentrate and they count the passes, and they do pretty well at this. And at the end of it, the experimenter asks, okay, so did you notice anything unusual during this exercise? And about half the people will say no. And let's concentrate on those. You say, well, did you see any other person or thing move into the field of view from the right side and exit from the left? And they'll say, no, I didn't see that. And they'll say, did you see the gorilla? And they'll say, what? And then if you play the video back to them, in addition to the 6 people tossing balls around, in the middle of the video, a person wearing a gorilla suit walks into the scene from the right side, stands amid this crowd of people who are passing the ball back and forth and moving around each other, thumps his chest 3 times, just like a gorilla would do, and walks out to the left. And people are astonished that they missed this. How could I have possibly not seen that? The reason they didn't see it is because our cognitive faculties are adapted for reproductive success. And in this particular case, what's going on is we have this very powerful ability to focus our attention, to do selective attention. And these people have to pay very close attention to where the ball is going and who has a white t-shirt on. And that's really all they're concentrating on. And other things that are going on around them are distractions, and the brain suppresses that, becomes blind to it. So this kind of thing happens all the time. You just gave a great example, seeing your friend from a distance. Your brain inferred, oh, that's so-and-so, I know that person. And only later when you got closer, you realize, oh no, it's actually not. Your brain is filling in missing information, just as you said. Or sometimes, in the case of selective attention, it's cutting out information that's extraneous and harmful. But being able to focus your attention can be life-saving. If you're in the savannah and you have reason to think you're being stalked by a leopard, and you need to focus your attention on where that leopard probably is. So this is, a warning I just want to raise, and it's kind of how I see this stuff.
Yeah, so let me say, John, I didn't see the gorilla when I watched that thing, and I was completely shocked because we all think we're better than average. So I thought,
yeah,
I always think I'm going to figure this psychology thing out when. Just one quick response. So I don't mean to say that you in your scientific lab are misapplying the principle of simplicity when you go out and you believe there are other persons. But I do mean this. I don't think our belief in other minds is a testable hypothesis. So I think the denial of all those crazy things are not testable hypotheses. But we trust our cognitive faculties that they're putting us in touch with that reality. And then what cognitive science shows us many times is that's not the way things are. Or like vision science has done that. For example, you might think roses are red, but you might come to learn that roses are made of tiny particles that absorb some ray of light and reflect others, and the light that it reflects impinges on our retinas and goes through our rods and cones and projects redness, and we say roses are red. So learning just how vision works might make you think the world isn't the way you thought it was. Anyway, there are things that are testable hypotheses, but I think the denial of all those crazy hypotheses, the point is they're not testable either. So our belief that there's a past, it's just an assumption that we make. It's one I think is true, and one that we have to trust, but it's not any more testable than the other one. I wish these were all testable hypotheses, in which case I think philosophy would have been a lot more successful by now. But they're not. And this is the other remarkable thing. We have these dusty little cognitive faculties, and the scientific revolution didn't start until 1500, roughly 1500 AD, because it's so freaking hard to have the things that we have figure out and it astounds me what you can use this mind, that when you figure out how our cognitive faculties likely evolved, that it's able to do what it does. It just completely astounds me. I admire scientists, John, and I admire them more after I learned about neuroscience and cognitive science, because I thought, human beings probably needed to count how many people were in a battlefield, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but where did we get infinity and zero and all these things, that the calculus, and but it all started with 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sure that's what it all started with. And people that couldn't count accurately were removed from the gene pool. So counting became something that was passed on to future. The ability to count was passed on. Well, learning the calculus wasn't passed on. Lots of people can have kids. It's just not innate. It's so far from what the kind of dusty origins of those faculties. So it makes me astonished at what scientists can do, given the kind of crappy equipment we have.
Yeah, we do. I agree with that. It is astonishing. I'd like to say a little about what you just said about, believing that other people have minds. I don't accept the idea that there is no evidence of another person's mind. I think we use evidence all the time in deciding whether or not a person exists and a person has a mind. You say we can't see another person's thoughts, but actually, that's strictly speaking, that's becoming not true because of neural imaging techniques. But for most of the existence of human beings, there has not been fMRI machines. So let's put that aside. I can walk out to the room just a short distance from where I am now, and I will after this session is over, and see my lovely wife, and I will be able to tell pretty much instantly what kind of mood she's in, how she's feeling. We can have a little conversation, and I can know much more specifically from language what's going on in her mind, what she's been doing, what she's been thinking about. All of this is coming to me through my senses. It's indirect evidence of what's happening in her mind, but I take it as very real, empirical data about the mind of another person. And to me, I don't see anything particularly unscientific about that.
But how would you test that she's not some automaton, or that it's not just all in your head? Or I don't see I mean, I totally agree. We're pretty good at mind reading.
Well, I cannot test that it's just all in my head, right? I agree that that's an untestable idea. It's a silly, untestable idea. Like I said, one of a universe of untestable ideas, one that could be true. But why waste our time with it when it's just no more or less plausible than any of the others of these infinitely many implausible and untestable ideas? No. So I just don't waste my time with it. So for the same reason, I don't waste my time worrying that my wife is an automaton. The day may come when we do need to worry about that. I don't think I will live to see it.
That's true. That's another.
We probably won't live to see it, but it's coming, I think. The day is coming when artificial intelligence will equal in every imaginable, measurable capacity the capacities of a real human mind.
Yeah.
And if we can make robots with skin that feels convincing enough and little electric heaters that keep at the right temperature, it's going to be really hard to tell whether a robot is a human or not. But you know what? If that day comes, and you incorrectly infer that this is a human with a human mind, you're not necessarily incorrectly inferring that robot has a human mind. It may have an artificially generated mind that is pretty much indistinguishable from a human mind. But we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, but I would say in that case, it wouldn't be irrational to think that that's a person until you saw the circuit board in the back or something. Then you have evidence against it. But not a biological person. I might actually argue in that case that it is a person. It's just one that we've managed to synthesize. Yeah, it could be.
We never could do, but I think it could happen someday.
Yeah, if I may interfere again, I still wanted to find the time to pose my question to John. But before that, Kelly, the CSR has been around for around 30 or 40 years now, correct?
Something like that.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure before that 30 or 40 years time, back in, for example, 1980, someone could actually articulate, Kelly, your commonsensical epistemology. No, you presented also again against the CSR. What happened in that 4 decades? what have you learned from that? Because one might say, okay, given the advancement of CSR, I mean, religious belief has not been disproven, but at least the degree of religious belief, given the neuroscientific explanation of religious belief, should be decreased. And you also mentioned the humility lesson that we might take from the CSR. So I wonder, do you categorize that humility lesson that you might take from the CSR in this kind of the degrees of belief? Before the CSR, the degrees of religious belief is 0.6. Now it's 0.5, for example.
So this is for me, not John, I take it. Well, so I'm not calculating this. I don't have an algorithm that applies to beliefs in general. It depends on persons and times and circumstances. So you're asking, so maybe you're asking autobiographically. In my case, what has it done? And I'd say it's decreased it a little bit. I worry that that what John says might be the only reason for my belief. So it has had some impact on my belief, and I suspect it's had a big impact on lots of people's beliefs. But let me just twist the knife a little bit in another direction. There also is cognitive science of atheism. Atheism is associated with well, they're just some obvious things: conformity bias or prestige bias. It could be hiring bias. There are a lot of atheists in the academy, at least in the humanities. It's hard to get hired if you're known to be a religious believer. It can be hard to get hired. It can be hard to get hired in the political science department if it's known that you're conservative politically, that you're a Republican. And I take it we're not any better now at showing whether being a Democrat or being a Republican is more likely to be true. And yet, if you ask departments when they hire, they won't take it to be that students have become more likely to be Democrat because of conformity bias and because of peer pressure and because of hiring biases. That no one gives psychological causes for the reasons for their beliefs. It's always somebody else's belief. Let's see. No, I've gotten myself a little off track here. So anyway, whatever pause it gives you with respect to your belief, the understanding the evolutionary causes of beliefs is, as Daniel Dennett said, a universal asset. It applies to all of your beliefs. So it applies to atheist beliefs too. There are psychological reasons that incline atheists to belief. So it's not like only religious believers are psychotic or have underlying psychological causes. All of our beliefs do. And so I have a chapter on atheism. And here's the thing I say about atheism or autism. None of us should speculate about whether or not Richard Dawkins is autistic. It's not. We shouldn't psychopathologize people who disagree with us. We should try to understand their reasons and not psychopathologize people. And we should know what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Whatever position we end up with is going to be one that may have had underlying psychological causes that we're totally unaware of. Things operate underneath that, and neuroscience starts to uncover them, but that they uncover them in general cases. That the experiment with the ape, 50% of the people were susceptible. Well, I don't know how ambitious John's claims are that everybody, all the time, under every circumstance, it's just what he said. Human beings are super complicated. There are all sorts of reasons and psychological causes for all sorts of things that human beings do and believe. And we're pretty good at walking into a room and knowing if our wife is happy or angry at us, but we're not that good at just running around telling why somebody's an atheist or a religious believer or an agnostic or why they're a Republican or a Democrat. But we like to say why. We like to psychopathologize people, usually in ways that put the other person down and elevate us. And I think that's a bad thing. So,
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
was somebody talking?
2 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, 2 minutes. Anyway, I don't want to keep going on. I just think it's super complicated to think, did my belief get reduced? Well, who am I, for one thing? And the other is, whatever happened to me or whatever has happened with John and his beliefs or anyone else, there are things going on that we don't all know, that he doesn't know, that I don't know. And I'm not going to try to guess why he believes what he believes. I'm going to read what he says and try to take what he says seriously and respect him as a human being and respect him as someone who, like me, is trying to do the best he can to figure out the truth. So if there's any lesson we can take from all this, it's that we should respect and honor people who believe things who are really different, because people like John have made us more aware of how complicated it is for us to think clearly and rationally and to get at the truth. It's super complicated, and you made it more complicated, John.
Yeah,
And,
well,
thank God if there is one.
John, do you have anything to add?
well, I would just say that, there's one thing that occurred to me while you were saying all this about, why people are atheists. And I agree with you that people come to atheism by a variety of different paths, just as people come to religious belief by many different paths. But there's one interesting little piece of data that I thought I should mention, which is a study that was done in the late 1990s that was comparing religious belief. Now, this is done in America, so about American adults. If you look at American adults in general in the late 1990s, roughly 90% of American adults believed in a personal God who answers prayer. If you look only at scientists, American scientists, that number drops to about 40%. But if you look at the most elite scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, then the number drops to 7%. 7% of members of the NAS believe in a personal God who answers prayer. So that says several interesting things. One thing it says is that the more deeply enmeshed you are in scientific thinking, the better and more successful you are at scientific research, the less likely you are to believe it, less likely it is that you will believe in a personal God who answers prayer. I think that's a very telling statistic, very, very revealing finding. I think it says that there's, as you say, thinking in a way that thinking in the scientific way, something humans have only been doing, as you point out rightly, only a few hundred years, because it's so difficult to do. It took a long time for us to stumble on it. It's hard for most people to do. Most people are bad at it, and even the best scientists make mistakes and go off the rails, as I think Francis Collins did in his interpretation of his feeling of God's presence as evidence of God's existence. So we all have those flaws and so on, but the more practiced you are at science, the more you demand evidence to form your beliefs, the better you are at that, the less likely you are to believe in God. Now, it's been pointed out that the most interesting thing in that study was overlooked by the authors, which is not the interesting thing is not that 93% of NAS of NAS members are atheists. It's that 7% are not. What explains them? What explains the Francis Collins, for example? And most people just threw up their hands at that. There was a conference about it some years ago that nobody had a good answer to it. It was just a puzzle. But I think I have a good answer for it. That's what my book is all about, that illusion of God's presence. It's a cognitively impenetrable illusion. It comes with a vivid feeling of knowing. It's not just the feeling that there's this loving presence nearby, but it's a compelling feeling of knowing that this is real. I've experienced it myself, so I know what it feels like.
Time is up.
Can I
Yeah.
can I muddy the
Could
water there,
you
though?
please, Kelly, could you please just reserve it for your a closing statement, if you don't
All right.
mind? Yeah. John, thank you both, by the way. Very interesting interpanel discussion. John, may we have your 5 minutes close statement, please?
Sure. Just
Yeah.
give me just a second here. It's easier for me to do this just reading it from the text that I've written. I have a lifelong friend who shares many of my interests and values. Though our intellectual paths diverged, I became a scientist while he pursued mysticism. For years, we debated our worldviews, always striving to avoid hurt feelings, though this became increasingly difficult. Eventually, I came to appreciate how emotionally attached he was to his spiritual beliefs and how much they had helped him cope with life. So to preserve our friendship, I quit debating him. He needed his beliefs, even if, in my view, they were false. And so it may be with some of you in the audience today. Religion can offer salvation from addiction, comfort in time of loss, or friendship to the lonely. I tried to warn you in my opening statement that there are real risks to seeking truth above all else. At some point, belief ceases to be a choice and is compelled by the evidence. For example, an Apollo astronaut could never believe the Earth is flat. At most, he could only pretend to believe it. I have reached that point with respect to belief in the supernatural. Now, if you can't live without your faith, I can understand that, but be careful. The religious path has risks too. Religions make extraordinary claims about invisible beings with supernatural powers. Holy men claim special access to the mind of God and tell us how we should think and feel or behave. They promise us miracles if only we will pray to the right God in the right way. They tell us to accept all of this on faith without evidence, and that doing so is a virtue. A great danger in this is that it trains you to be detached from reality. Humans are extremely good at rationalizing. If you really, really want to believe something, you'll find a way. Once you start down that path, you become easy prey to malevolent leaders. In America, a man who fomented a violent coup against our government now has a real chance of being reelected to the presidency. It's no accident that his most ardent supporters are evangelical Christians. They are experts at disconnecting themselves from reality through faith, rationalization, and refusal to look at contrary evidence. They take their religion far too literally. There's a better way to approach religion, as a famous author once explained in an interview, and I'm just going to read you an excerpt. We know of many religions which have ceased to be active, like extinct volcanoes. The Greek myths of today were originally the Greek religion and had temples and priests and inquisitions, no doubt. The world is full of dead religions. And to my mind, what happens when people stop believing in them literally is that you can then believe in them in a more beautiful way, a story. Many of the ancient traditions suggest that there's a moment when human beings outgrow the gods. I see that as being related in a human life to the process of growing up. When you're young, even when you're an adolescent, you need parents. But there's a point at which you move from that to being able to make your own life decisions. I see that religious experience as being part of the childhood and adolescence of the human race. And when we grow up, hopefully, we grow out of it. Ironically, that author was Salman Rushdie, who was nearly stabbed to death less than 2 years ago by a man who apparently took religion far too literally. If you'd like to try a different path, if you want to understand reality as it is, not as you might want it to be, then I have a suggestion. Try science. You don't need to be a PhD to be a scientific skeptic. The main thing you need is the courage to demand evidence and to seek truth wherever that path leads. But a few good books would help too. If you've been steeped in creationism and want to understand evolution, I recommend Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. If you've been taught that morality comes from God and wonder how atheists can find meaning in life, then I recommend The Good Atheist by Dan Barker. And if you're struggling to make sense of that compelling feeling of God's presence, then you might try my book, The Illusion of God's Presence. Shedding religious belief can be exhilarating and liberating. There's a good reason we call ourselves free thinkers.
Okay, thank you very much. Kelly, your 5 minutes closing statements, please.
Yeah, thank you, John. So I want to respond to just a little bit. I didn't write a concluding remark. I wish I had, John. Dang it, that was good. The scientists and atheists, there are explanations of them. There are psychosocial explanations. One is that the higher one is up on the autism spectrum. The more likely one is to be a mathematician or a theoretical physicist, and the less likely one is to believe in God. And so women are more likely to believe in God and to believe in a personal God, and men are less likely on average. And then the more professors are less likely than men on average, and then mathematicians than professors on average, and physicists than mathematicians on average. And then the higher up you are on that perspective, the more likely you are to see the world abstractly and to be a systemizer and to do the things that are really good in science. So it may just be, and I don't know, it's very complicated. It may just be that that what's reflected there is what you find in the autism spectrum. Maybe it's complicated. The same might be. A lot of people believe in God, in cognitive science or religion, for existential reasons, that belief in God relieves existential anxiety. Well, so does having wealth. Wealth relieves existential anxiety. So you find as people increase in wealth, the less likely they are to believe in a personal God. So there are socioeconomic reasons why. And again, not every religious believer is one that's ready to die for their faith. Some of these psychosocial causes are only skin deep. And when your existential needs are satisfied, well, then my guess is you'll find people pray a lot less, for example, if they have a lot more money. But at any rate, you find unbelief associated with increased socioeconomic status. Same is true with levels of education. But again, levels of education may be things that track socioeconomic status. In the US, the more highly educated you are, the better on average that you are socioeconomically. So that might be a factor. And then there's also in the academy, as I noted before, there's conformity bias, and then there's prestige bias. People want to be like, and it's not that hard to get this stuff going. That's how susceptible we are to these sorts of biases. It's not hard to get unbelief going if some famous person expresses unbelief. And again, and the thing is, you don't have to do it in a classroom. It doesn't have to be because of any work that they've done. The most powerful argument against most positions, happens in the bar after a talk, when someone says, Francis Collins, did you hear he was a religious believer? Ha ha ha. And then you get a horse laugh. And just like that, everyone knows what the right thing to do is in this circumstance, if depending on who says it. Anyway, prestige bias is super powerful. Academics are not immune to it. So I just want to complicate the picture that John drew there, because I think it is complicated, and all of these things need to be teased out. And I don't want us to find big winners or losers in this. I hope the audience doesn't go away and say, oh, John really, well, I definitely hope they don't go away and say, John really nailed Kelly. I definitely hope that. But I hope they don't go away wanting to think like, who's the big winner of this? I hope they go away saying this, the truth is out there, but it can be really hard to figure out. And I hope as religious believers, that they get a better understanding. If you're a religious believer and you think there's a God, I think hopefully you come away with learning from John better what it's like to be a creature. We're not intellectual gods. We don't stand above everybody. I know in the Christian tradition, you used to think we're just below the angels, but Darwin said we're just above the apes. And to me, that's a better way to look at it, because you get a better sense that we're creatures rather than disembodied angels running around just floating above everything. We don't float above everything. So, and being creatures means that we see through a glass darkly. We don't have perfect knowledge on this. We need the courage to face, to look into the evidence and to face counter evidence. And then we need to understand it's hard to figure out how to sort all of this through. I don't have an algorithm. I think what I mean is you can't just input the information you have and output what you should believe in this case. It's really difficult. And in some cases, I think what the output will be for some people will be belief really decreases. For other people, I think it doesn't have to. It can stay the same. So I don't think it undermines everyone's rationality in every circumstance, but it could some people in some circumstances. And that seems to me the way most things go for most humans in most circumstances.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the floor is now open for Q&A. If I may take time to pose my question to John. John, scientists usually they are methodological naturalists most of the time. And given methodological naturalism, I wonder whether CSU so far has been able to prove religious belief or just be able to explain neuroscientifically religious belief. But, without adding the metaphysical naturalism, it is highly unlikely that one might be able to disprove religious belief. So don't you think then that those scientists just like you who think that they have disproven religious belief, they are maybe hiddenly, they are adding metaphysical naturalism rather than the methodological naturalism to the scientific findings in order to disprove religious belief?
It's an interesting question. I don't really claim to have disproved religious belief. At least if I come across that way, I don't mean to. But there's such a huge variety of religious belief and so many different conceptions of God. It's very easy to come up with a definition of God that is empirically not testable. So if you have one of those, then I can't disprove it, and I won't even try. In fact, I've put that into my long list of infinite things that are untestable, and I won't waste my time worrying about them. But if you have a God who interacts with the physical world in a way that is empirically measurable, testable, if, for example, you believe in a God who answers prayer, and you believe that this God is loving and omnipotent and can do a whole bunch of stuff, and a whole bunch of you in this religion get together and say, well, cancer just causes terrible human suffering, and a loving God surely would help us with this affliction. Let's pray to God that all cancers be eliminated from the human population, and all at once, tomorrow. And these religionists get together and issue this prayer, and they say on the internet that they're doing this and announce it, and most people ignore it until the next day when suddenly there are all of these people going into remission, and the cancer surgeons are opening up the abdomen and saying, "My God, there's no tumor there," and on and on and on, and the news is flooded with this astonishing news that science cannot explain, that all cancers have vanished. And it just so happens to be when this group of religionists prayed to their God in the right way that this would be granted. That would be a fantastic thing if it happened. I'd love to see it happen. In the real world that I have so far seen, it doesn't. But if you have a God that you think could do such a thing and put it to the test, then science can give you an answer. And the answer is probably going to be no. That just doesn't work. You get results that don't differ from random chance. So, to that extent, science can do something to test the existence of some particular version of God. But I don't know. Did I answer your question? I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So
I will say in John's defense on this, there have been a gazillion empirical studies on prayer, and they're not very promising for the religious believer. And a friend of mine wrote a book on petitionary prayer for Oxford University Press. And he's a religious believer, but he doesn't think God answers prayers, in part because of the empirical evidence. There are other reasons to pray. Pray has an effect on the prayer, but it doesn't seem to have much effect on the world. And again, this is probably, this may be disturbing for a lot of people in the audience to hear. I don't know, but because I don't know what Muslims think about, asking God to change the world through prayer. But there've been lots of double-blind studies on prayer. They initially did some studies that weren't double-blind, and the people knew they were being prayed for. And if you knew you were being prayed for, you did get better. But that could be some kind of placebo effect. People, if people feel their doctor cares for them, they seem to do better. So anyway, real serious double-blind studies have been not so great for petitionary prayer.
Okay, so we have got a bunch of questions and a very limited time to actually ask them. So let me begin with the first one, which is not directly relevant to our discussion, but this is philosophically a very interesting question. Question 1, do you think, and it is not addressed to any specific debater, I assume both of you could answer, do you think Bayesian reasoning is the appropriate method for distinguishing between belief and reality? Evidence only changes the probability of belief. Kind of relevant to the question that I asked from Kelly regarding the decrease of religious belief given the advancement of CSR.
I think the problem for Bayesianism is actually assigning values to partial beliefs. Maybe it's easier in the sciences. I don't really know, but it's not easy in metaphysics, for example, or epistemology. So it's not easy to. All the beliefs are assigned against a set of background beliefs. It's not entirely clear what's allowed in the background beliefs when you're talking about metaphysics, for example. So I think Bayesianism is really cool, and I admire people who do it. I think scientists use it all the time effectively, but it's just really much harder to do metaphysics, because you have to be able to assign values to partial beliefs to get it to work out. You can do it sort of roughly and say, let's just assume that it's less than 50% or more than 50%, and you could show some general result based on an assumption, but it's all totally assumption based. and values people often give. Richard Swinburne assigns values in his book, The Existence of God, and tries to show it's overall probable that God exists than not. But I don't know where he gets his values. It's like he pulls them out of a hat. So it probably works in some areas, but not so easy to work in other areas.
I could chime in with just one little thought on the same subject. The question triggered a thought for me. What Bayesian probability does is, and I'm not an expert at it either, but it uses what are called prior probabilities. You start off with an estimate of a prior probability, that sort of an initial estimate of the probability of the thing you're trying to get a final probability for, and then you enhance that with evidence that you accumulate that maybe adds to or detracts from your confidence in the probability that this thing is true. Most people conceive of God as a disembodied mind, a mind or spirit that has form somehow without being in a physical brain. And in the universe we know, in the reality we see and observe and study in science, there is no instance, none, zero of such a thing existing. We have never seen anything like that. We have no evidence that anything like that has ever existed. So I would assign the prior probability very low to something like that, infinitesimally small, which right off the bat, is a way of saying that the existence of God as a disembodied mind is not very likely to be true.
So about the same time that Richard Swinburne wrote The Existence of God, J.L. Mackie wrote The Miracle of Theism, and he assigns the prior probability of the existence of a disembodied mind to nearly zero, just the way you suggest. Well, then when you multiply it by any sort of positive evidence, it isn't going to rise very high, because 0 times anything is going to be 0. Well, then you have to have if you're going to respond to him using Bayes' theorem, then you have to have a reason to assign a higher prior probability to the a priori existence of a disembodied mind. And I don't know a better way to do it. People act like they know how to do this in metaphysics, but I don't know how to do it in any way that's the least bit compelling. Like, how could you persuade John or Mackie that they're doing it the wrong way, that your value is the wrong one and you should make it like this, without already assuming that there's some sort of initial likelihood to there being a God based on nothing? This is that's how you assign prior probabilities. Like, what is your background knowledge? How do you figure this out? Based on principles of logic or something in metaphysics. Well, they don't say anything more favorable about the probability of the prior probability of the existence of disembodied minds. So that's why I didn't use the word prior probabilities, because not everybody may have known it, but those are the values that look like they're really hard to figure out how to assign when you're doing metaphysics or ethics, or the list could go on and on.
Okay. So the second question is for Dr. Clark. I agree that rationality is not necessarily associated with truth, but I think we need to go in details and leave the general statement of the quote-unquote possibility of finding belief in God as a rational belief. The question is being considered here is the new finding in CSR. Can a person still rationally believe in God? Taking your example, if after all the new evidence, one still believe in the earth is flat, is it acceptable? If now CSR says that you believe in God because your brain works in a way that consider agent for everything, can I still believe in God rationally?
So yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really good way to put it. And it presses me in ways I think that John was trying to press me. and I feel the pressure. So all of that, like the intellectual pressure, I'm not feeling anything else here. But yeah, I think a person can still believe, just like I think a person, suppose, there's a lot of neuroscience of ethics, and there's a lot of cognitive psychology about of ethics. And so a lot of what happens is you got parts of your brain that get washed with serotonin, and you feel good about this. There's studies that show how deeply motivated we are by shame, for example, and then studies that try to remove the reasons people give for beliefs. So none of us thinks we should. No culture, I think, thinks that brothers and sisters should have sex together. And so there are cognitive science studies where people act like they're not just, it's not just the sort of grounded, that it's grounded in some reproductive success. It's not good for human beings in general, reproductively, to have sex with their brothers. And so people that did that probably in the long run were selected out. But and so then what happens is stigmas get attached to that, and shame gets attached to that. There are all sorts of things that get attached to what may have a really deep, much deeper primordial cause. And so studies are done like, well, so what if the brothers and sisters have no emotional attachment? What if they use contraceptive? What if, and you could go on, where you remove things for the reasons that people give. And it begins to look like there are certain kind of emotional things or biochemical things that are moving us in certain directions. And I think that is pretty powerful for what might be the origins of morality, for understanding what might be the evolutionary origins of morality. I don't think that we should give up keeping promises when we find that out. I still think it's true that we should keep promises and that it's
Sure.
good, even though there are evolutionary and psychosocial causes of why we might have those beliefs. So there are all sorts of analogous beliefs. It's just that people think it's somehow religious belief is the one everyone should just give up. But we have a whole host of beliefs that we just begin with trust, and then finding out that there might be causes of them. The question is, are they strong enough to erode our trust in those cognitive faculties? And for some people, there might be sociopaths that think, oh, now I have even more reason to do just what I want to do. There's nothing to those beliefs. They're all illusions. So Dawkins wrote the God delusion, but he could have written the morality delusion and the social justice delusion and the atheism delusion and the person delusion, and the list could go on and on. And so each person has to kind of wrestle with this and decide if they think the underlying cognitive mechanisms are strong enough to overcome their deep commitments to those beliefs that they gained in the first place by trust. But human beings probably have a history of what brings about those beliefs.
Would I comment on that just a second?
Yeah, please.
I agree with most of what Kelly just said there, and it's a fascinating subject to get into. But the research on moral intuition is how I would put it. There are powerful intuitions that have evolved in humans that push us in certain directions with respect to our behavior with other people, which is what we call morality. What's right and wrong to do when interacting with other people. Other people are real. Other people are beings we see in front of us. We have empirical evidence of them every day. And societies, human society and culture is real. God probably isn't, as far as I can tell. And that's the distinction in my mind, why I think it's helpful to be willing to give up these ideas and belief in God, and why I think that the cognitive science of religion and my hypothesis undermine belief in God. I don't think it's equivalent to the case of morality. I don't think just because we have scientific insight into moral intuition, therefore morality doesn't make any sense and we should just get rid of morality. I don't think anybody's saying that. But with belief in God, I think it's important to align our beliefs to the extent that we can with the truth, with what's real. And like I said, I see the two examples are qualitatively different. That, if the thing that makes you think God is real is this warm, fuzzy feeling that you get in these moments of existential crisis or whatever, and then we can show you that, well, actually, there's a perfectly natural explanation for why you would have those feelings, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything supernatural. And if that's the only reason that you feel that God exists, then you maybe should think seriously about just giving up on that idea.
Okay, the next question, which is a very lengthy question, is for Dr. Wathey. One of major arguments that you posed was the unity of mind and brain. However, it seems there are two counter arguments. First, you seem to have based your assumption on the Cartesian substance dualism. However, there is also emergent dualism, by which some scientists and philosophers believe that although brain is the basis of mental functions, there are emergent properties, such as consciousness, intentionality, qualia, what's it like to be a bat, that can be fully explained in terms of neural processes. The second counter argument for Dr. Wathey's mind-brain thesis is this. There is the embodied cognition argument, by which some cognitive scientists, such as Andy Clark, Francisco Valera, and Eleanor Roch, believe that cognition has to be explained holistically by the involvement of brain, the whole body, environment, and even the cultural context. The latter cognitive scientists are against reducibility of mental processes to purely brain activities.
Okay. First of all, the first part of the question has to do with dualism and so-called substance dualism versus kind of emergent dualism. And the claim is made that there could be this emergent dualism, things like qualia and so on, that cannot be explained in terms of neural activity, and that this is therefore somehow evidence against my argument for mind-brain unity. Okay, I believe that is a logical fallacy. That's kind of a red herring. The important question here is not how does the brain produce the mind. You don't need to answer that question to decide between the unity of mind and brain versus dualism. The important question is, the relevant question is, does the brain produce the mind? Not how does the brain produce the mind, but just does the brain produce the mind? That's a much simpler question, much easier to answer, and we have abundant, overwhelming evidence in favor of mind-brain unity when you just approach that question. In my book, I go through a long list of predictions that mind-brain unity makes. I actually listed a few of them briefly in my opening statement. And I also mentioned 3 predictions that dualism makes. And for example, If well, I won't go into the details now. I don't think we have time. You can look at them in my book, but the upshot of it is that dualism fails pathetically with respect to the predictions it makes, whereas there is overwhelming evidence for the unity of mind and brain. Let's see, the second part of your question, I can't
We have
remember.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes. The second part was about embodied cognition and even cultural context relevance of the cognition and how these are against the reducibility thesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, now this is first of all, I think the idea of embodied cognition is a very powerful one, and I actually discuss embodiment in both of my books quite a lot, and I think it's intimately related to this illusion of God's presence. As a matter of fact, I describe the illusion of God's presence as kind of a phantom sensation. The brain produces the compelling illusion in an amputee that a missing limb is still there because the brain expects it to be there. And I think it's doing something similar, expecting a being, a loving being, when you have this illusion of God's presence. But again, I think, I agree that we cannot at present explain everything about consciousness and qualia and so on in terms of neural activity. But that does not mean that they are somehow separable from the physical brain. We have no evidence, as far as I can tell, that such a thing ever happens.
Okay, I've got less than 5 minutes. So let me actually pose the last question. It is for Kelly, but I would like to have John's take on that as well. If science does not undermine our religious belief, how do you think it can impact it? Do you think it can give us more abstract views of God?
Science. So except for the kind of case John makes, I think most of the time it's not that useful to talk about like science and religion. I think there aren't really good definitions of science. There aren't really good definitions of religion. So asking if science and religion are in conflict is, to me, it's kind of a nonsense question. But particular religions have deliverances, and those deliverances can come in conflict with particular sciences, which make deliverances. And so I've already mentioned three on which I changed my mind. 40 years ago, I thought, as a religious believer, I was required to believe that God created all the species directly in 6 days about 10,000 years ago. And I've come to be a defender of the sciences of evolution and various cosmological sciences. And I think that I had to come to a new understanding of my religious beliefs. There was something John said. John has this article his paragraph where he talks about how religious beliefs might be an internal contradiction. And I came to agree with that. I just published a book with Cambridge University Press called God and the Problems of Love. And I have a chapter on exactly the issue that John raises. And I argue that Christians cannot believe that God loves us in any way like any kind of love that human beings could possibly understand, and punishes people for eternity in hell. So I make exactly the case he did. And I loved me some hell 40 years ago. Like, it was part of my religious belief. And I just have come to think that has to change. Now, there wasn't anything about science in that so much, although I've looked at some of the cognitive and neuropsychology of love. but mostly I've just looked at like love and parents caring for children and how we understand love. I looked around at the world, and honestly, yeah, sorry, I've met people like you, and I just couldn't find myself believing that all Muslims are going to hell. I just couldn't do it anymore. So it wasn't especially science, but it was gaining experience that I didn't have before. I didn't know any Muslims when I was in college. So it was easier to think about you as a group, and then what biased people told me about you than me. Here's a scientific attitude than me having experiences of you and then letting you tell me what you think and reading things by Muslims and let them tell me instead of somebody else. Anyway, I think particular religious beliefs can come in conflict with particular deliverances of science. I won't speak for Islam and science here because I don't know Islam that well, but Christianity has had a lot of particular claims that need to be revised in light of the sciences and in light of our experiences of broader experiences of humanity. So,
Yeah, thank you. John, what about you? Instead of or rather than undermining, what would be the impact of CSR on religion, specifically on the conceptions of God?
Yeah, I would take that question in a direction very similar to where Kelly took it, and the same things associations occurred in my mind. I watch a show on public television fairly often called Closer to Truth. You're probably familiar with it. It's done by Robert Lawrence Kuhn. He's a neurobiologist by training, so I kind of empathize with him. But he interviews a lot of philosophers and discusses, meaning and whether God exists and all this stuff. And he's very curious about if God does exist, what would God be like? And I would love to have him talk to me about that sometime. I'm trying to get him to interview me someday so we can have this conversation. I have an answer for him. What is God like? I think biology has an answer for that. Now, what it really describes is not what God is like, but it's an answer of what our human nature projects onto God. And it's the answer to the question I posed in my initial statement, which is, why is God two-faced? Why is God, cruel and punishing and judgmental, but also unconditionally loving? That's contradictory. And I think that says something about human nature, really. But we just project that onto God when we imagine God. And those two forces, it's a long answer. I've written a lot about it, and I'm not the only one. Most of the scientific literature on religion, has to do with the judgmental, punishing God and how that contributes to cooperation within tribes of hunter-gatherers. It's a long, fascinating story, which we don't have time for, but you can find that and read about it. But I agree with Kelly that's a crucial question, and it says it's something that I think science can at least offer an explanation for why the gods that we tend to create have these two incompatible faces.
Yeah, okay. I think it's time to wrap this fascinating debate up. On behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, ICCNC, I would like to thank Dr. John Wathey and Dr. Kelly James Clark for their intriguing debate. I personally benefited a lot from it. And also, I would like to thank the people in the audience, wherever you are. If you're interested in this debate series, please stay tuned. Each season or so, we will have one such debate. It's always free and no registration is needed. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon again. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, John.
thank you, Yasser.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
John.
Thank you. Cheers. All the best. Bye.
Enjoyed it.